Hi, I'm Chris Ingstad, President of Iowans for Tax Relief, and today I'm joined by Jared Walczak of the Tax Foundation. Jared is a senior policy analyst there, and he's based in DC, but he studies all 50 states and he travels across the country talking about tax policy. He's a nationally recognized expert, cited in many publications like the Wall Street Journal, and plenty of media hits on stations bigger and better than our local website here. So Jared, because you study taxes in every state in the nation, maybe just start by telling us how Iowa's entire tax system compares with the rest of the states.
Okay. Well, Iowa relies a little more heavily on property taxes for local government than you see in the average state. It's about 5/6 of your local government tax collections. You tend to see something more like 2/3, maybe getting to 3/4, but you're a little higher than average. So property taxes are a really important part of the system. Obviously, more broadly, the state has embarked on a number of reforms to reduce the very high top rate of the individual income tax to eventually bring down the corporate income tax and make some reforms within those taxes. I think the next step that a lot of people are talking about are how do we try to constrain the growth of property taxes, and that's an important but also a delicate issue in a state where it's so important to local governments.
Yeah, I think you're right about what the public thinks. Our polling done in January shows that a vast majority of Iowans, regardless of party, regardless of being rural or urban, we do have urban areas in Iowa, Jared, want the legislature to take action on property taxes. More recently, the Des Moines Register released a poll with similar results. So, as we know, people care about property taxes, and I'd say hate's a strong word, but why do so many people seem to hate property taxes?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you talk to economists, if you talk to people in public finance, they love property taxes. They say that this is a tax that reasonably scales with the benefits you're receiving. It passes the so-called benefits test, that it's relatively economically efficient, that people aren't changing their behavior that much because of property taxes. But you talk to the average voter, they do not like property taxes. And I think there are a couple of reasons, and they're fairly good reasons. One, you're seeing your property taxes rise because of appreciation of value of your property, which is a good thing. You want your property value to appreciate, but you're not realizing that right now. You're only realizing that value when you sell, and you might hold on to this property a long time, so there's an ability to pay question. Two, it's incredibly radically transparent, and I love that about the property tax, but you don't see it with the competing taxes. You do get it on every receipt with your sales tax, but how much did you pay in sales tax this year? I doubt anyone knows. Even with income taxes, with withholding, a lot of people really don't know what they owe in income taxes. But you get a property tax bill in the mail. You know what you paid, and you get your assessments.
You cut one big check for it.
You cut one big check, and that is a painful thing to do. And I know some people have escrow, there are different ways this works, but property taxes, you feel the impact. And even if it is a better tax than many of the others, I think people feel that. And then there's just equity questions that arise around property taxes that I think can be addressed to make sure that the property tax is reasonably related to what they're actually getting out of local government.
One of our members has pointed out, just because his house is now worth more doesn't mean he has more dollars in his pocket to pay for it. So, some of that centers around assessments, and you talked about that. So in Iowa anyway, it seems like as assessments or valuations increase, that seemingly has property taxes on autopilot.
Yeah.
So what could be done about that? Would something like budget limits at the local level work?
Yeah, so right now Iowa is a little unique in how you have property tax limitations. You have a class-wide, which is a class of property-wide rollback, where in the entire state, the value of residential property or the value of agricultural property can only be increased by a certain amount in a given year. And if it rises above that, there's a rollback that affects all taxpayers. This doesn't necessarily affect you that much individually. If your property value grows much more than the statewide average, the rollback's going to help you, but you're still going to pay substantially more than maybe some of your neighbors. The problem with doing it that way, if we're going further in that direction, is you can create a lot of inequities in the tax code. What I think could make sense is some sort of revenue or budget or levy limit. They're all words for the same basic concept. The idea that the total growth of collections from property taxes can only rise by a certain amount in a given year.
And are you talking about sort of city by city or county by county?
I am at a local level. So in a given city, a given municipality, you can have your collections rise by a certain amount in a given year. It can be a set amount like 2% or 2.5%. It can be an inflation measure. And if you want to go beyond that, you can go to the voters, you can ask for an override, but generally speaking, you see a limitation to this amount. That gets beyond the questions of what the rate is or what assessment values are, because those things can be in flux, and actually ask the real question, how much are you raising?
So if the total budget limit were in place, that sort of would factor into or trickle down to whether it's rate or assessment or anything else. It's pretty simple algebra, right? So if you did a limit like that, would that put shackles on local government though?
No, I don't think so. About 35 states have some sort of levy limit, so these are pretty common, and local governments have found ways to deal with them. And I think voters are actually quite willing to increase their property taxes if you make a case for why. One of the big things we see in states where you have to go to a voter override if you're going to grow collections by a significant amount, you don't see as many increases. It's easy to sort of hide an increase in the budget,
Sure.
and you're less likely to do that if you have to go to the voters. But if you can actually make the case, if you can say, we need to build a new fire department, we need to build a new school, we need to improve our roads, make the case to voters. Voters are often willing to pay for it because those things are important. But I think that transparency, make the case to the voters and let them make the decision, is a really important thing.
It makes sense. And so again, when you see that, has that effectively limited the growth of property taxes in other states?
It has. We've seen the growth of property tax collections decline in those states, which isn't to say that property taxes are declining in those states, because that's not the goal. The goal is to limit the rate of growth so you don't have radically increasing bills from year to year.
Keep the growth of local government in line with kind of the rest of us.
Yes.
Okay. So as you talk about that limit and you talk about it applying locally, is that the best way to do it? Is it best for limits to be applied locally or city by city as opposed to statewide?
I think it is. In both cases, of course, the state, through legislation, is imposing some sort of cap. But the difference between a state aggregate cap flowing down to you and a local cap is huge, because what's happening in one part of the state, what's happening in Des Moines, has very little to do with perhaps what's happening in western Iowa. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to try to carry that all across. It makes far more sense to focus on local budgets and say, you've clearly shown that you can live within a certain budget. There are going to be increased costs. There is a rate of growth associated with just the costs of government. So you have that rate of growth, but you can't go beyond that unless you go back to the voters. And you might be able to make the case that we need new services, we need new facilities, but make it a local issue rather than trying a one-size-fits-all approach for the entire state.
So there'd be transparency or even additional votes taken when you really need additional revenue. Otherwise, you don't get to just keep grabbing it for free every year.
Correct.
That makes sense. So, one thing I've heard local government folks talk about, especially as it relates to assessments, increasing those tax bills, is they say you should be happy your house is worth more and you're going to pay more in property taxes, and if the state thinks that's an issue, then the state should take care of it, whether that's issuing an additional income tax credit for the state or some other sort of shift to the state burden. What do you think about any sort of shifts in that scenario?
Yeah. Well, there is some truth. You should be happy that your property is valued more, and it makes some sense for you to pay more because of this, though we need to have some caution there because you haven't realized that value yet. And that is why a lot of these limitations exist, and you can go down the wrong path there. But the right path does want to take into account that just because your property is worth more doesn't mean you immediately have more ability to pay. A state transfer is, I think, the wrong approach and the wrong direction, because any sort of tax shift creates accountability issues. If the state provides local governments with additional money by raising some sort of state tax, whether it's income tax or sales tax or something else, do we really have an assurance that local property taxes will be that much lower than they would have otherwise? And even if we do have that in the first year, are we able to constrain the growth of property taxes in the future? Or can local governments just say, oh, look how low our property taxes are now. We clearly have substantial room to grow to get back to a national average or a regional average. Generally, we see this where the shifts aren't actually effective in lowering overall tax burdens.
That shift looks nice for a year or two, and then it's up in smoke and gone.
It is. Often it results in higher overall collections, and it shifts to perhaps taxes that are less desirable. Property taxes, even sales taxes, tend to be very economically efficient taxes. Income taxes and some of the others options available, those aren't as efficient, and they're part of the overall revenue picture, but I'm not sure if we should be shifting more into those categories.
We've talked about a budget limit. Another idea that's kicked around and some states have implemented is a limit on the growth of assessments. Is limiting the growth of those assessed values a good idea?
I don't think it is. There are a number of concerns that arise. It creates perverse incentives for homeowners, because usually then your assessed value only is allowed to rise by a certain amount, or maybe not even at all in a given year, even if the actual market value of your property has driven up substantially. So what happens? Well, it only changes. It only gets reassessed if you sell, you change the use of your property, or maybe you expand it substantially, build some improvements. So you're disincentivized from renovating or improving your home. You're disincentivized from selling. You get a lock-in effect where people aren't willing to move, where people aren't willing to upgrade or downsize even though they'd want to, and you can't convert the use of a property to its best use. And then you get a situation where you might have properties across the street from each other, look identical in every way, but one of them just sold, and one of them has been owned by the same family for 20 years, and their property taxes, the effective rates could be massively different. One could be double.
California's had that system in place since the 70s, and there's some wide disparities in those bills there.
Radical disparities across the street, and then you get crazy things like people not actually filing death certificates for parents who passed away because they want to continue to live in the house at the lower assessed rate. That is not the way to be doing this. It creates distortions, it creates inequities. I think it's very unfair to
unintended
taxpayers.
Consequences.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about, you kind of see where we're going with some of these limits that might be good ideas. How do you account for growth? Are cities penalized for growth with this type of budget limit in place?
No, I don't think so. Firstly, any sort of new construction or new growth would have to be outside the cap. Because think about...
Meaning cities could get sort of full credit for the new development that's gone on?
Absolutely, they can get full credit, and that is the goal here. Because if you think about the different ways that your budget can grow, if I have a property that has increased in value, I don't necessarily have increased demand for government services because of that. If, on the other hand, I'm a developer and I create 50 new housing units, or I bring in a new shopping plaza, well, there are new costs for government, and it makes perfect sense that property tax collections would be able to rise to cover that cost. The goal here is to avoid large incidental increases that may in fact be hidden because the rate hasn't changed, but collections have gone up. If there are changes to property use, property taxes should reflect that. And I think that's very easy to do. It's the way that most states do this. Improvements, changes to property are outside the cap, but when we're just talking about the same value, the same property, that is only subject to a certain growth factor.
Last question for you, Jared. One important factor that drives economic growth is a competitive tax code.
Yep.
States with better tax climates seem to perform better economically than those with poor tax climates. So with that in mind, have any of Iowa's neighbors taken big steps forward on the property tax front, or are some of them at least trying to improve their property tax codes?
There are some neighbors that are trying to do things on property taxes for better and for worse. Nebraska is looking at some property tax limits. I worry they'll go in the wrong direction, where they may shift this more towards income taxes or other taxes that may make them less competitive, and we're talking with them. We want to make sure that they do this in a competitive way as well. Illinois, of all states, actually does have some property tax limitations that you do not have, that does constrain the growth of property taxes. Of course, they're starting from a really high set point, especially if you're in Cook County, but really anywhere in the state, you have some really high property taxes. So limits on growth, but maybe starting at too high of a baseline. States like Wisconsin, the Dakotas have some limitations as well. But this is a national issue. We see states across the country putting limits in place. It's important to make sure that there's still some local government flexibility. It's important that you don't put more of a burden on other taxes that can be less economically competitive. But people want some predictability. And I do think there's a lot of value in recognizing that there's some limit to how much local government can grow, at least without coming back to you and asking permission.
You mentioned Illinois, so I'll ask you one more question. Their governor recently pointed to Iowa's income tax code as a model to follow. As Iowans, should we be proud that Illinois is holding Iowa's income tax code as a model, or should that scare us a little bit?
I think it should scare you a little. Of course, the new governor of Illinois seems to be unaware of the changes that are in the works here in Iowa, because of course Iowa's income tax rates will be declining in the next few years and ultimately getting down to a top rate of 6.5%. He doesn't want a top rate of 6.5%. He likes 8.98, and of course he doesn't want to bring in the federal deductibility that has reduced that. So you're not as bad as the governor of Illinois would like people to believe, but on the other hand, you do not really want to be a model for where a state like Illinois should be headed.
We want to keep moving in the right direction. So, Jared, thanks for your time. You've spent a couple days in Iowa. You were at the Capitol yesterday. We're going back up there soon. You're speaking to a number of groups, so thanks for the work you do here.
Well, thank you.